Right now, you are wearing somewhere between 2 and 7 separate pieces of fabric. You probably put them on this morning without thinking about it. You've been doing it your whole life. Every human you've ever met has done it. It feels so obvious, so automatic, so completely non-negotiable that it barely registers as a choice. But at some point in our history, nobody was doing it. Every human on Earth was walking around completely unclothed, and then gradually they weren't. Something changed. Something pushed us from one state to the other. And the story of how that happened and why turns out to be one of the more revealing things we know about what it means to be human. So, when did it start, and what actually caused it? Let's start with what we know, and why finding out is harder than it sounds. Clothing doesn't fossilize. A hide, a plant fiber wrap, a woven mat, none of these survive tens of thousands of years in the ground, so we can't just dig up the first shirt. What we can do is look for the tools that made clothing possible and the biological evidence that clothing was being worn. Both of those trails, it turns out, lead somewhere surprising. The tools came first. Scrapers, stone tools specifically shaped to work animal hides, appear in the archaeological record roughly 780,000 years ago. That's not clothing, but it's the beginning of the skill set. Hides that are left untreated rot and stiffen. Hides that are scraped, worked, and softened can be worn. Someone was doing that work. Someone was turning raw animal skin into something usable long before we have any direct evidence of wearing it. The biological evidence is stranger. Scientists figured out how approximately humans started wearing clothes by studying lice. Body lice, the kind that live in fabric and clothing, are genetically distinct from head lice. They evolved as a separate species at the point when humans started covering themselves regularly enough that the lice had a new habitat to adapt to. DNA analysis places that divergence at roughly 170,000 years ago. That's our best current estimate for when clothing became a consistent enough part of human life to reshape the evolution of a parasite, which is a genuinely odd way to learn something about ourselves.
But 170,000 years ago, the world was in the middle of a glacial period. Temperatures were dropping. Portions of Africa, where anatomically modern humans were living, were becoming significantly colder and more unpredictable than they'd been before. And here's where most people assume the story ends. Cold equals clothes. Simple. Except it isn't quite that simple. Warm-blooded animals that lack body hair don't survive prolonged cold exposure without insulation. That much is straightforwardly true. In sub-zero conditions, an unclothed human loses heat faster than they can generate it and dies of hypothermia within hours. So warmth was clearly part of the answer. But clothing didn't only spread into cold regions, it showed up everywhere, including populations living in warm tropical climates where temperature alone couldn't explain it. Protection was probably just as important as warmth, and it gets talked about far less. A hide wrapped around the body shields against insect bites, and in the ancient world, insect bites weren't just annoying, they were a primary vector for parasites and disease. A basic skin covering also protects against thorns, sharp grass, rocky terrain, and the kind of constant minor injuries that without modern medicine could become infected and fatal. Clothing as armor against the environment, not for temperature, but for basic physical protection, makes sense across climates. And then there's the part that's hardest to measure: what clothing meant. The moment humans started wearing animal hides and plant fibers, something else started happening too: decoration. The oldest known ornamental beads date to around 130,000 years ago. Shell jewelry, ochre pigment, feathers woven into hair or clothing. People weren't just covering themselves for warmth or protection. They were choosing what to cover themselves with. They were making statements. They were signaling group membership, status, experience, identity. The hide you wore after a successful hunt communicated something about you. The decorated edge of your garment said something about who you were and where you belonged.
This is the part that separates human clothing from every other adaptation in the natural world. A polar bear grows thick fur because evolution selected for it over thousands of generations. A human child puts on a specific jacket on the first day of school because of what it says about who they are. That gap between biological response and symbolic communication is the entire distance between an animal and a person, and clothing sits right at that line. There's also evidence that the ability to make proper clothing, to process hides, to cut and shape material, to eventually sew using bone needles, was linked to the broader cognitive shifts happening around this same period. The same populations producing early clothing were producing cave paintings, long-distance trade networks, and increasingly complex tools. Clothing wasn't just a practical response to a cold snap, it was part of a wider explosion in the human capacity to reshape the world to suit us, rather than simply adapting our bodies to fit the world. We eventually became so dependent on that capacity that we lost the biological alternative entirely. Modern humans have the least body hair of any primate. We are technically not equipped to survive without clothing in most of the climates we currently inhabit. We outsourced our insulation to technology so completely that our bodies stopped bothering to maintain the backup system. Which means whatever that first ancient human did when they wrapped a hide around their shoulders and walked out into a cold morning, that decision, or something like it, made us permanently dependent on our own ingenuity for survival. We have been wearing clothes for so long that we forgot we chose to. And we have been choosing to every single morning ever since.